Well, good evening, folks. My name is Dr. Timothy Padgett. I'm the resident theologian here at the Colson Center. One of my favorite things about my job is the opportunity to have conversations like this, to have some good discussions with some people about important issues that affect us all as Christians. And our goal here at the Colson Center is to help people with that. Our formal mission statement is to equip Christians with the clarity, courage, and confidence to live as Christians in this cultural moment. And our cultural moments change from time to time, and ours is a particularly tumultuous one. And so we're hoping that with events like this particular one and all the other ones we've had before, that we can help you live as a better Christian, live more Christianly in your daily life. Now, tonight we'll be addressing something that really has been in the news a lot in the past, decades. We're talking about the issue of the state of Israel and the Christians' relationship to it. Now, it's been a regular point of contention since 1948, just 4 years after the D-Day events that many people around the world have been honoring just today. Just 4 years after that, the state of Israel came into being as its own independent country. And this was a radical move, and people didn't know quite at first how to respond to it, coming out of the wake of the Holocaust, and then what they to do as a Jewish state. Now, from that time, so many years ago, all through the decades of many wars, the 1948 war, the 1956 war, the 67, the 73, and so on, the place of the state of Israel within the American Christian conscience, view of the world, the worldview, has been a complicated one, and Christians haven't always known quite what to do. It's been very much a hot-button issue. The conversation has touched on questions flowing from what to do with the people who were, decades ago now, fleeing from the Nazi Holocaust of the 1940s. Then it gets on to other issues about questions of end times and things like dispensationalism. And you think about the Left Behind movies and all these things, the way that our culture has been affected, not just within Christians, but with the wider society, with the issue of the place of Israel in the American psyche, in the Christian psyche. It is gone to the point where now it's intersecting with intersectionality, where the issues of globalism, imperialism, decolonization, and all these critical theory issues, all these have joined together to make this already complicated issue even more complicated. But it's been in the last few months that this issue has really come to the fore in many ways. It's always been an issue, but it's really become very heightened in the last few months. I mean, all of us last October 7th, we watched in horror. The reports began to come in that terrorists had broken through the Israeli lines in southern Israel, and that they were killing and raping and kidnapping, holding prisoners to this day, civilian prisoners to this day. And we didn't know what to do with this. It was quite a shock. I remember I was at a play, Les Mis, watching on my phone as the reports were coming in. It was such a shocking moment. It was the biggest mass slaughter of Jews since the 1940s. That's a huge thing. Some 1,200 Jews were killed. Many other people as well within that 1,200 were people from other nations. Then things changed. It did not take very long for many people who had been, you would expect to be supporting the people being killed and things like that. All of a sudden they were either silent or they spoke out in support of the terrorists, in support of Hamas and things like that. The logic being that since Gaza was held to be an open-air prison, since the Israelis were held to be European colonizers, anything that the Hamas, that Gazans did in response to the Israeli occupation was justified, anything whatsoever. And that led to some very interesting things. We've all seen the news in the past few months as all these campus protests and occasionally riots have broken out across America, across the world, with people on the far left beginning to echo statements that we usually would associate in historical terms with the far right. We've gone from merely critiquing the Israeli stance, the Israeli tactics in this particular war, to some of the biggest tropes of anti-Semitism you've seen in centuries and decades past. And that's been hard to reconcile. All of that thrown onto the already difficult position that many of us as Christians feel about how we were supposed to relate to the Jews across the world, to the state of Israel in particular. What is the relationship? The fact that American Christians, some of the biggest supporters, encouraging the United States to support the Israelis, has been not just a theological issue, but a political issue. It's a place where all the worldviews come together. And so we're left with this situation where a lot of Christians are asking themselves, what am I supposed to think about this? How am I supposed to respond to these things? There's slaughters on the one hand, there's questions of genocide, there's questions of oppression and colonization. How am I supposed to feel about this? And I think that this is not an easy question to answer. It would be easy. It would be nice if it were easy. In one sense, I think we can have a clear answer, but it's not an easy question to answer. And I think that a lot of us really wish we had some more knowledge, more insight into what these situations are, what's going on in Gaza, in Israel, what's the history behind all of this, who are the Palestinians? As the questions you saw as we were getting started here indicated, there's lots of questions related to this overall issue. And so it's with that goal in mind that we at the Colson Center have invited a couple of guests to join us here. If I could ask them to join in here on our virtual room here. We have Dr. Eric Patterson here is joining us. He serves as the president and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation and is scholar at large at Regent University's School of Government. He's the author of over 20 books, including most recently, A Basic Guide to Just War Tradition, Christian Foundations and Practices. And I'd like to thank you, Dr. Patterson. I've actually read that book, and that's a bit of my scholarly focus. I enjoyed reading that, so I'd like to thank you for joining us.
Tim, you're welcome. Thanks.
Absolutely. And then Dr. Jeff Myers is president of Summit Ministries. So he and I are actually only a few miles from each other, and I'm going to be next door to his office here in a couple of weeks doing some teaching there. But he is the president of Summit Ministries, which has trained hundreds of thousands of young leaders to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. He's the author of 18 books, including the new book, Should Christians Support Israel? And again, thank you as well. I also thank you for half of our staff, half the staff here at the Colson Center at one time or another. I was either a student or an employee at Summit, so it's kind of, and you've stolen recently one of our employees, Casey Leander, one of our writers. He is now working for you. I love that kind of symbiotic relationship we have there. But I'd like to thank you, gentlemen, for coming and joining us for this important set of questions.
Thank you, Tim. Great to see you, Eric.
Likewise. And I worked as a janitor for a few weeks at Summit in the 90s.
Hey. All the connections come together there.
That's right.
So, just a few housekeeping things before we get going. If you've participated in one of these forums before, you'll know how basically this works. We'll have a time of discussion, a series of questions that we've kind of worked together that hope to illuminate the key things that people need to know to understand the issue that's going on, to maybe fill in some gaps around knowledge, to clarify some things like that. We'll go on with that for the next about 30 or so minutes. After that time, we'll have a short break, about a 3-minute break, be a little video, and then we'll have a kind of some live streamed questions coming in. Now, to be precise, what you do to send them in, if we could get the number listed up here, just this number, 844-872-1088. So at any point, starting now, you can go ahead and start sending in your questions, whatever they might be, and we'll work through those and decide which ones we think are the best ones. Now, again, we usually get hundreds. I often am the one who's handling those questions. We get hundreds of these questions. So if we don't get to your question, it's nothing personal. It's just there's so many of them that we need to get to. And so it's a great opportunity for you to bring these questions to these men who can bring some good expertise in this. Again, so I think that's all the housekeeping things. Let me open in prayer. This is such a significant issue. Let me open in prayer, and then we'll get to our questions. Dear Father in heaven, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of Christ and David and all the apostles and all the church down through the ages. We pray that you would be with us in this often emotional issue, very intense issue. Guide us and protect us from false ideas. Help us to zero in on the things that need to be done. And we pray for a good conversation tonight that will illuminate our brothers and sisters, not just here in this audience, but perhaps around the world. We pray that you be with us in this. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
Okay, well, we have a series of questions. The first one I have for Dr. Myers here is just about this book. I know that, I listed out some of the things that have been going on in the world that have led to these situations, but what was it specifically? What was it you were observing? What was it you thought was missing that you provided this book for us?
Well, the book you're referring to, Tim, is called Should Christians Support Israel? I wrote that book because right after the October 7th terrorist attacks, I began to notice that Gen Z, the young adults I work with, hate Israel. They hate it. They hate everything that Israel does and everything that Israel stands for. And I'm not just talking about a small percentage of this generation. The Harvard CAPS poll showed that 51% of young adults, this was in November, 51% said they believe that because Israel is an oppressor state, that anything Hamas did was justified. That percentage went up to 60% by December. And I knew I needed to address this for the students I work with at Summit Ministries, but realized we have some kind of a stewardship responsibility for this entire generation. What are these young adults not understanding? What's actually going on? So I did several things. But one of them is I put on my Kevlar vest and my Kevlar helmet and went to Israel with a small group of leaders to meet with Arab and Jewish journalists, intelligence officers, IDF, Palestinian educators, and a variety of other people, including survivors of the massacre and hostage families. And in all of that, I brought all of my hard questions with me. I found everybody that I met with very open and willing to talk. And I came to understand in a new way that Israel has a right to exist, that Hamas is an apocalyptic rape and death cult that must be ended in its military and government influence. And that finally, theologically, that God is not finished with the Jewish people. They are part of his covenantal plan. So writing the book was the opportunity to put together all of the facts. And if you would like to see it, I'll just go ahead and give you, because we've got free copies for everybody who is on the call tonight at summit.org/forum, summit.org/forum.
That's great. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate that, because I said it's such a complex issue in so many ways. I think there's some clear moral guidelines that we can talk about, but in terms of the competing interests and the people, I mean, I've been surprised just when we at the Colson Center have done some things about this issue. The fervency. We were accused of following Israeli propaganda when we simply cited basic stats that everyone acknowledges. It is quite a remarkable situation we find ourselves in, and the fact of the animosity towards the Israelis. And again, as we were talking before we went live, just against all the Jews is not merely anti-Zionism, anti-Israeli, but against all Jews whenever, all sorts of places. And it's a very haunting thing. I never, even as a historian, I never would have thought I would have heard some of the statements that have been made in the past few months. So. Well, thank you very much for that one. I think that's very helpful. Next question I have for Dr. Patterson here. Like the term just war theory, just war doctrine, just war tradition, things like that. Actually, we posted something about just war tradition recently, and someone fussed at us. It's like, I thought Protestants didn't do tradition. I was like, well, yes, we do in this. But if you could, I mean, for those of us, if you're a military history buff like I am, or you study theology, you had some familiarity with the idea of just war. But if you could lay out for our audience, what exactly is that idea? Where does it come from? What are the basic precepts? How does it work out in practice? Because I think we hear it, a lot of us hear it, but we don't know exactly what it is. So if you could just use your expertise and guide us with that.
Well, Tim, the good news is this, that the vast majority of Christians for the past 2,000 years are denominational traditions. So Catholic, Orthodox, Reformed, Wesleyan, Lutheran, Baptist, etc. All of those major traditions, with the exception of the tiny group of Anabaptists, have affirmed just war teaching. And maybe not everyone realizes but all of the major religious traditions, and that includes then almost all of the non-denominational churches in America today, are in one of those traditions, and they affirm this longer tradition. The place to start is with the Bible. And in the Bible, we see some doctrines that we won't go into a lot of detail here, but the Bible does have a lot to say about justice. It has a lot to say about spheres of authority. There's authority in the family, there's authority in the church, and there's authority in civic life. We call it government or public authority. We see that people are called, they have a vocation to public service callings. Moses, Joshua, Hezekiah, David, Joseph, Nehemiah. In other words, they're called to protect and to defend the people in their charge. And that's true in the New Testament, where Jesus essentially blesses a centurion, where Paul gives greetings to the public administration of Caesar's household and to other people in public life. And of course, we have Romans 13 and other places in the wisdom literature. Isaiah, for instance, chapter 10, verse 1, differentiates between leaders who make just decrees, but a condemnation of those who make iniquitous decrees. We could go on, but the Bible, whether it's stewardship or vocation or neighbor love, has a lot to say about law, politics, and society. And so this tradition, which really we should call just statecraft rather than just war, but it has this moniker of just war thinking or theory or tradition, really asks for the last 2,000 years 3 questions. The first is, when is it moral to use force? The second is, once that decision has been made by proper authorities, when is it moral, or how can that force be employed in a moral, restrained fashion? And then the third is, with an eye towards peace, what does an enduring and ethical security look like? And let me just hit that first question because it's really important. The primary categories there are that proper authorities, legitimate government authorities, may choose to use force in some cases based on just cause and right intention. So authority, just cause, and right intention. And what do we mean by just cause? Well, self-defense of the community, preventing future wrongs, punishing wrongdoers, righting past wrongs. So security and justice in the hands of public authorities. But what's really important here, and this is a major Christian innovation in political life, is to look at right intentions or motivations. So neighbor love, justice, righteous indignation, impelling us to pursue security and justice. Those are all licit or legal or righteous motivations. But greed, lust, envy, hateful wrath, revenge, those are not. And so that's the essence of the just war tradition. And it really starts with government authorities who have a calling to protect and to defend civic order and the common good, and that they should be doing it not out of hate, but out of a sense of neighbor love and the obligation to protect.
That's really good. I really appreciate that. Just the emphasis that we tend to think of war and violence. We tend to think of force as merely violence, and it's not the same thing. That's an important distinction to be made. I was actually just recently, and he might be on this, he said he was going to be listening to this, so he might be on here. I had a conversation just this past weekend about pacifism and just war when we were down in Texas. And someone he was saying that, like, when are Christians going to move past retribution and seeing that war is solely in the terms of retribution? And I get the logic. There's something to that. There's a logic to that. But I said that if someone comes into my house and breaks in and is going to do harm to my children, my wife and my children, if I act with force at that moment, that's not retribution. That's restoration. That is restoring the right order. That's keeping the peace. And I love the fact that the Christian tradition has, going back centuries, millennia even. You look at Augustine of Hippo, he has the letter to, I think it was Boniface, Count Boniface, a Roman official who was considering becoming a monk. And Augustine says, no, you have a role to do here. And then Luther, 1,000 years later, has a letter to a soldier, and he says, when I think of the destruction that comes with war, I can think of nothing more unchristlike. But then when I see that he's protecting, keeping the peace, and again, that's the restorative thing, holding the peace, that he can see as nothing more Christ-like. This is the right thing to do. Okay, thank you so much for that. Well, let me see, another question I think that really comes up with this is, again, you might say, what is Israel? Because when we read, as Christians, we grow up, we read a Bible study, there's Israel, and there's Israelites, and there's Israelis, there's Jews, there's the state of Israel, there's all these things that mix together. And I think that can cause some confusion. So I guess one of the questions I have here for Dr. Myers is, what is modern Israel, the state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, 1948 and now, what is the relationship between that and ancient biblical Israel, covenant people of God? And there's lots in there and lots of controversy. But if you could, I think that's something that people could really appreciate hearing something on. So if you could answer that, Dr. Myers.
You bet, Tim. Well, I can at least give some insight into it. I don't think it can be thoroughly answered, but I'll talk a little bit about it right now, and then maybe if people want to ask questions more specifically, we can dig into it. The Jewish people trace their history all the way back to Abraham. You remember the covenant, Genesis chapter 12 through 15, where God put Abraham into a deep sleep and had divided the animals the way you would in a covenant. You're essentially walking through the divided pieces of a carcass to say, if I break this covenant, what has been done to these animals be done to me. And God set Abraham aside, and God alone walked through those pieces. And so we call it the Abrahamic covenant, but more specifically, it was a covenant God made with himself on behalf of Abraham. Mm-hmm. The Jews trace their history all the way back to that. The covenant is always in scripture related to the land, no matter where you look. Exodus, Deuteronomy, you look in the Psalms, it is always the people in the land, the people in the land. In AD 70, Jerusalem was destroyed by a guy named Hadrian, a Roman general. And in order to punish the Jews, he changed the name, which was Judea. He changed it to Palestine. Palestine in Arabic is Philistine. There is no relationship between today's Palestinians and the Philistines of old, but Hadrian thought that would be a sufficient way to curse the land. And everybody who grew up in the land from AD 70 on was called a Palestinian. If you were a Jewish person, you would be a Palestinian Jew. If you were a Christian, you'd be a Palestinian Christian. If you were Muslim, you'd be a Palestinian Muslim. That went all the way until after the 1948 establishment of modern Israel, in which a guy named Yasser Arafat decided that we're going to only use the Palestinian term to refer to Muslims who are of an Arab heritage. Nobody else gets to be a Palestinian. And so it seemed like there was a huge break through all of those years because Jewish people were scattered around the world because of this war. But you know, Jerusalem has only ever been the capital city of Israel. It's been an administrative district all through lots of time, even into the Ottoman Empire, but it was never a capital for any nation other than the nation of Israel. And the Israelis, I mean, this might be a question that comes up. Why do we call the people of Israel, why do we call them Jews? Well, Judea was the dominant tribe in Israel. And at least in the time of Esther, probably before, we know that there were references to the children of Israel being referred to as Jews. So they're the only people group who have a constant presence in the land for 3,500 years. All of the surrounding states, including the Palestinian territories, are political districts that were marked up and put together through negotiations leading to the United Nations, Great Britain, and the United States.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. Actually, as I mentioned just before, I always find it fascinating when people have people say the Israelis, they're not indigenous to the area. And as I mentioned before, there's an Egyptian stele from 1209, I think, BC that mentions Israel. So they've been there a very long time, and you see the history of that. And also just it gets people get very concerned with, you know, are the Jews actually from the area? When they talk about Palestinian things, well, sometimes it is, as you say, very clearly talking about Jews, like the soccer team from the Palestinian soccer team in 1930. Half of them were Jews because it was a regional thing, a descriptive thing. So definitely lots going on there. And I love the fact that when you talk about these issues of Israel and theology, we can sometimes begin to associate with particular forms of theology, like dispensationalism. But one of my theological heroes is Carl F. H. Henry, who, if you don't know anything about him, he has 2 PhDs, which is just insane that you would go through all the trouble to get 2 PhDs. And he was someone who was pretty strongly pro-Israeli, but he wasn't into the dispensational. So a lot of people think that it's only because of that theological stream that we've been effective with that.
Yeah, I mention something more about that just briefly, Tim? I think a lot of people view the issue in Israel as geopolitical. It's about a little slice of land. Well, it is not just about a little slice of land or a conflict in the Middle East. It's about everything everywhere. This is really, I describe it as a theopolitical conflict. If you don't understand the worldviews that are at play, then you won't understand why different people are doing the things that they're doing. That's really a critical thing to understand. I think, you know, my approach in the book is, well, look, I know dispensationalists have a view, Catholics have a view, all these different views. Are there things that we can all tie together around? And one of the clear ones is Galatians chapter 3, 6-9, because this is almost undisputedly one of the writings of the Apostle Paul. And he says, those who believe are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. In other words, Christians have been grafted into God's covenant with the Jews.
Yeah, and one of my favorite things about your book was you talked about it as an anti-Gnostic thing. The physicality of the Jewish people is an anti-Gnostic thing. And if anyone's followed Colson Center things for any time, you know that's one of our favorite things to do is to talk about the kind of a little g Gnosticism that has always been a bit of a threat in the world. The hyper-spirit, or the super-spirituality, if you want to go for Schaeffer's term there, of the church, and it kind of denies the physicality of the world.
Well, right. Yes. That's the theology that you would have if Israel didn't exist as a nation state.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So before 1948, everybody's assumed when Israel's referenced in Scripture, it must be just a spiritual metaphor, because it's not a physical place anymore.
Right.
But now that it is, a lot of our theological categories we probably should be taking a closer look at.
All sorts of dissertations to be had in that one there. So
yeah.
Well, for Dr. Patterson, dealing with your issue, you mentioned that the just war tradition can be derived from the Bible. I know that some people will look to like Cicero or people like that as well, as some fountainheads as well. But where in Scripture do you see the just war tradition? Where do we derive it from? Where are some examples, you know, like where it plays out, where we can point to Scripture and say this is where we're getting it?
Well, much of our theology is looking for very specific scriptural texts, but then from there we have to make some judgments about how that applies in the political and social realm of our life today. So, but there's plenty of biblical literature here. So we start with Romans chapter 13. And remember, there's no page break between chapters 12 and 13. Paul just wrote it as a single letter. And in chapter 12, he talks about the importance of believers being active citizens in loving their neighbors, being humble in things. And he goes straight into, and not only in your interaction with your neighbors, but also in your interaction with civil authority, government is there for your good. Government is a common good. It's part of common grace that God has instituted for everybody. And what is it supposed to do? It wields the sword to protect and to defend the vulnerable, the weak, the average citizens from the depredations of criminals and others. And that's why we're told to support it, not just with kind of allegiance, but also in things such as paying taxes. That ties directly to Jesus saying, and remember, Jesus could have said to a Jewish audience, Caesar is bad, Rome is bad, we are the pure people, don't render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. But that's not what he says, right? He says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and unto God what is God's. We see in the case of John the Baptist that when Roman centurions come to him and they ask him, what should we do? Now, these are Roman legionaries. They're probably Italian or from somewhere on the Italian peninsula. They are not believers. They are not Jews. They are not Christians. They come from an idolatrous background. And what does John say to them? He says to these earnest seekers, in your vocation, don't overuse your power in a way that defrauds the poor, and be content with your wages. And in a sense, he is affirming the high aspirations of public office for them. And of course, we're told both by Paul and Peter in introductions to epistles to be praying for those in authority. And we see throughout the Bible, from Cornelius the centurion all the way back to the book of Genesis, that there are people in public life who are righteous and that they are working on behalf of the common good. And let me just end, because with the wisdom literature and the prophets over and over again have things to say about counting the cost. So stewardship, a king should count the cost before he builds a tower. The king should count the cost and have many counselors before going to war, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of these pieces there that actually just normalize an approach to say that government authorities have a role to play to protect and defend and to pursue justice in social life. And that's the genesis, that's the basis for then trying to apply this tradition to real world cases.
Absolutely. I think you're right. I mean, the number of soldiers and military things throughout the course of the Bible is dramatic if you think about it. I mean, I know that's part of that is simply because, sadly, between Eden and the New Jerusalem, military affairs are part of life. There are going to be conflicts. There's going to be things like that. But you look you look through like Deuteronomy 20, and there's regulations, the Old Testament. We tend to think of the Old Testament as just being God's vengeance on thus and such. Well, there's the whole Joshua's thing, and it's intentionally set off. But you see that the rules. You can't. I love the fact that it says in Deuteronomy 20, you can't cut down the fruit trees. It's just this random little thing, but it's putting this. It implies that war sometimes has to happen. But there are limitations to it. You're not to do that. So much is in there. So rich, such a rich theology that can be in there.
Tim, can I pick up one more thing there? And that is, I mean, I see it coming up in the queue of the questions, and it's simply this: is that you earlier were quoting Martin Luther. C.S. Lewis quotes Martin Luther and paraphrases, and here's what it's about. People will often ask, well, what about the Sermon on the Mount when Jesus says to turn the other cheek? And I think that Luther, paraphrased by Lewis, really gives us a great answer there. Now, I'm gonna tell you the answer before we get to the quote. The answer is, there really is a difference between my interpersonal relationships with my next door neighbor and the role that a government authority has protecting and defending with dealing with criminals, dealing with terrorists, dealing with pirates, brigands, dealing with foreign armies. There is a difference because of the spheres of authority that people are called to. And so C.S. Lewis wrote, none of the Lord's hearers thought that when he said, turn the other cheek, that what he meant was that I had to step aside out of the way of a homicidal maniac, his words, to allow him to kill a child. And Lewis was reminding us that turn the other cheek had to do with all of the ways that Jews in first century Judea might get their pride, their ego bruised. Someone stepping on their toes is the way we'd say it today, and take offense. And Jesus was telling them, just like he said, turn the other cheek, or said, forgive 70 times 7. Don't let the petty grievances of life build up irritation between people. Be humble in those circumstances. But that's quite different. He never would have told Cornelius, a centurion, or a governor, oh, turn the other cheek and let an invading army massacre all of your people. These are different levels of authority.
It's a bit of an irony that the classic ethical example of should I ever lie that most people use today is, well, are you hiding any Jews?
Yeah.
And that now that question people have a hesitation with. And it's that's kind of a very sad state of affairs, that the very question you're getting with, does the call not to lie mean I always tell the truth in that context? That classic example is temporarily out the window. So lots in there.
Wow.
Well, we're getting close towards towards our break. So I want to give each of you, I know we discussed having some questions. I want to give each of you a chance to ask the other question. And I know from the email exchanges that you guys really admire one another's work and the insights that you each can bring. So I'll start with you, Dr. Myers. You told me what it is about proportionality. I mean, if you want to ask it in your own words, I mean, I can read what you asked me, what you said, or if you, why don't you just in your own words ask Dr. Patterson what you would like to hear from him.
Yeah, Eric, you and I have talked about this. It was my main question when I went to Israel, asking, especially in the IDF and intelligence officials, because we all know that war is evil. I don't think anybody disputes that. What we wonder, and what you've clarified for us tonight, is it's possible to have a just outcome under certain constraints so that evil does not reign. Because we do know that Augustine, you mentioned Tim, Aquinas, they did not consider death to be the worst thing that happens in war. They thought that the worst thing that would happen in war is that evil would be allowed to prevail. So all of that is the foundation. The big question that people are asking me is, well, 1,200 Israelis were slaughtered. Most people acknowledge that that happened, although there are some conspiracy theorists who deny that it ever did. Hamas denies that it ever happened. And then the Israelis, for the most part, have acknowledged that even though Hamas's figures of death are greatly exaggerated, and probably 2/3 of them are in fact combatants, that still there were a lot of innocents who died, and it may be 30,000 people. So the students are asking me, well, how is that proportional? 1,200, and then you go and 30,000 people die. Isn't that moving from just war to unjust retribution?
Yeah. And Jeff, when it's my turn to ask you, I'm going to tell you right now, I'd be very interested in hearing a little bit more about your time on the ground. And what can you tell us? Because I think that this one thing that's often missed is in your meetings with Israelis, the kind of religious and the spiritual climate, kind of your firsthand experience about if they're thinking about these things in those terms, or if we're kind of overlaying some of our own religious prejudices over the way that they're thinking about these things on the ground, because you have been there. So on this question, you may recall we said that there's 3 big just war questions. The one's about the decision to go to war in the first place. And the second one is about how force is used. And that, by the way, it's true for law enforcement or for the military. And there's 3 criteria there. The first is what we call necessity or military necessity. And it's the idea that all lawful means are available to be used on this battlefield in this specific place and time with a goal towards victory in this specific engagement. But that, in other words, we should try to win because we're trying to steward the lives of our own troops and we're trying to achieve our objectives. But tied to that, it is restrained by 2 principles. It's informed first by the idea of proportionality. In other words, that the tools and the tactics that we use in this encounter should be proportionate both to the grievance and the attack, but also to the level of threat now and in the future. And second, the idea of discrimination or distinction. We want to do the best we can to distinguish between legitimate military targets, so their army, their bases, their weapons of war, their capacity, their electronic capacity with their computer systems, et cetera. All of that is distinct from private property, hospitals, libraries, schools, and of course, innocent civilians. although that word innocent is a really hard one in some of these cases when you have a group like Hamas who has publicly said multiple times, you can watch it on YouTube, that it's perfectly legitimate to use their own people as what we would call human shields. In other words, their own citizens they treat as subjects and as a means to an end, not as humans with an inherent dignity. So what about this idea of proportionality? Has Israel's response been proportionate? And I do think there's 2 or 3 things to keep in mind. So here's the first one. I grew up near San Diego. Imagine that on October 7th, a highly armed band of Mexican cartel paramilitary soldiers crossed the border in San Diego, which is a multi-ethnic, multi-religious place full of tourists. And they killed in one Saturday morning, they raped, pillaged, and plundered 32,000 people. 32,000 people in sunny San Diego. And they took 10,000 hostages back across the border, many of which were still hostages 7 months later. Now, what I've found is that people are not often thinking about the scale of this attack on Israel, a country of only 9.3 million people, surrounded by more than 100 million Arabs and 100 million Iranians. It is in a very difficult place. And so when we start talking about battlefield proportionality in terms of an attack on that scale, as you said earlier, that mowed down anyone in its path, whether they were a Jew or not, Israeli or not, Arab, Christian, whatever, tourists were all in the path of that violence. And Israel's responding to that for a couple of reasons. One is the level of the grievance. The second is deterrence. And sometimes this is forgotten, but a very strong attack by Israel when it decided to move forward is in part designed to deter Iran, and especially to deter the large militias of Hezbollah, another terrorist organization that has a huge army and capacity on Israel's northern border. So one reason that you really, in a situation like this, you really demonstrate determination and power is so that you don't get attacked from behind. And clearly Israel is doing that. We know this because before they actually launched any weapons, they were issuing public threats against Hezbollah. Now, what's often missed in our media is that Israel drops leaflets and it sends messages by cell phones telling people to get out. What people often don't seem to realize is that no Arab country, no neighbor has volunteered to take, say, women, children, and the elderly at any time in this process. And you might think with all the outcry in that part of the world that people would say, Egypt would say, Jordan would say, Saudi Arabia would say, we'll lend a hand. Send us the elderly. Anyone who's over 70, we'll take them. Any kid under 10, we'll take them. But there's a reason that hasn't happened, and that's because Hamas has been ruling this area for 15 years, and those countries do not like Hamas. Hamas is a terrorist organization that's destabilizing. That's why Japan, the European Union, and so many places before this had already labeled them as an illegitimate terrorist organization. Now, I know I'm circling a little bit, but when we talk about proportionality, we need to be wise and informed and recognize that the decisions Israel has made have been, it doesn't mean that every decision has been right. It means that there's going to be battlefield, some errors and things. But by the most part, it's Hamas who put their command centers under hospitals. It is Hamas who shoots missiles at civilian cities in Israel. It's Hamas who did this attack. And there were kind of wolves gathering right at the gates like Hezbollah or the Houthi rebels in Yemen who've shot missiles in. And Israel's robust response is in part needs to be understood in terms of this greater context. And so I'd say that largely it's defensible. It meets these criteria of necessity and proportionality. And they have worked harder than almost any government to protect civilian life.
Yeah, I think that's a great response. I appreciate that. I noticed that John Spencer, who's America's leading expert on protecting civilians in a time of war, said that Israel has done more to protect civilians in Gaza than any army in history, including the United States and Iraq and Afghanistan, because they bind themselves to very strict rules of engagement. Hamas does not, by the way, as you mentioned. And they put wolves and their enemy, and also will use any means. But that's part of the Hamas charter. That their whole worldview is anything that furthers the resistance is considered legitimate self-defense, which is why Hamas will not distinguish between combatant and non-combatant deaths, because they believe that everybody's a non-combatant. If you're running down the street toward the IDF carrying a weapon and shooting, and they kill you, you're still an innocent victim because you were engaged in legitimate self-defense. You're a martyr. So,
and I think that point is really that last word that you use there. I think that's important. A martyr. So I'm not sure I'd call them innocent in this case, but you've rightly said this culture of death. So part of the evil legacy of Hamas in its 1987 charter, and then the upgrade of its charter 6 or 7 years ago, it's hatred of Israel. It's calling for the destruction of the Jews, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But teaching from when children are very, very small, this culture of death, kind of this glorification of seeking a martyr's death, spilling your blood in a way that is destructive rather than constructive. Those elements, this is an evil ideology, and we'd call it evil if it was the kamikazes in Japan in World War II, or kind of the death camp mentality of the Nazis. This is so against what we as Christians hold dear to about the fundamental dignity of every human life.
Absolutely. Well, I think if we have time for just one more question that Dr. Patterson, you could ask Dr. Myers, if you could restate what you'd said before,
Sure.
but just something I want to kind of predict for when we get done. A question I want to have is you'd explain something about the significance that today the Arab countries are sitting on the sidelines to a large extent, the Abraham Accords and all that kind of stuff. So I'd like each of you to kind of reflect on what that theological or political significance of that. So kind of predict that for later. But yeah, if you could restate your question for Dr. Myers so we can engage with that.
And Jeff, what I'd ask is, would you tell us a bit more about your experience on the ground, and in part, the religious and the cultural trends that you saw on the ground? Because we often, as evangelicals in particular, as many listeners are, we're very carefully looking at the scriptures, and many people are trying to apply, well, does this apply? Does this apply in this certain case? A lot of your book deals with that. But for our listeners, what did you see and experience on the ground?
The first thing I noticed, and it was true all across the entire country, as a friend of mine put it, they have a sense of we that we don't really experience here in the United States. The people I met with moved from atheists to strong religious believers in Judaism to Messianic Jews, from far left progressives to conservatives on the spectrum, and that their country has a right to exist and that it's worth defending. That was true for the Arab Israeli citizens as well. So that's one thing I noticed. A second thing I noticed is people felt the need to personally engage. Your question brings up this story. While I was there in the war zone, we were joined by a reserve major named Nir Balms, and he happened to mention that he was a professor at Tel Aviv University. So I looked him up later. Dr. Nir Balms is a famous professor who writes and teaches and speaks on international politics in Arabic, Hebrew, and English. And here he was serving at a small military outpost, preparing southern Israel to be ready to receive back the refugees and resettle into their communities where they had been attacked. So everybody steps up, and even people who are not in the military do this. I did have the opportunity to meet with a guy named Amir Tabom. Now he works for a very far left newspaper called Haaretz. And he is not a fan of Benjamin Netanyahu in the least. He would be, in our country, he would be considered far left progressive. And I asked him, so you're going back to your kibbutz? And he said, of course. I said, well, why would you do that? Because Americans, we wouldn't do that. If I felt unsafe in Colorado Springs, I could always just move to Chicago, right?
Oh, that's safe.
And he said, well, we go back. It's because it's a mission. I said, what do you mean it's a mission? He said, our presence there is the way we fight. That was extraordinarily significant because it's through our faithful presence, moving into the difficult situations rather than away from them, that enables us to persevere and for good and true things to persevere. I saw that in Israel in a way that I sort of coveted for our own country.
That's very interesting. Something as people listen to Breakpoint, we talk about the birth dearth and the lack of births and things like that. Israel is, I think, the only developed country that has a rising birth rate, or over replacement rate. And there is something, even among secular Jews, those who don't, they go to a Sabbath dinner with their family, but they don't believe anything. But the fact that they go to Sabbath dinner, they have that connection that does affect their birth rate in many ways. So.
Tim,
Okay,
can
well,
we just pick up one thing very quickly that Jeff said, and it's just simply this. Men and women who do national service, in other words, they serve in the Israeli military for a short time because of the existential threat that Israel always has, they're really civilians. Most of the IDF is made up of civilians. They were people who are doctors or bakers or lawyers or professors before the war started who've been called up to service because of the size of the threat to Israel. It's like the United States on December 7th, 1941. We had a tiny military, 300,000 men. We were not prepared for the attack at Pearl Harbor. And it was average Joes who became the GI Joes because they had to mobilize for service. And at the end of the war, they all wanted to go home. And so it's really important to realize that this war, by the way, also the Ukraine war, small military, where people have had to mobilize as average citizens and go to war. I met 4 professional musicians last week who had all fought on the front lines in Ukraine because they joined up after Russia attacked them. So it's worth remembering. This is not that Israel keeps this massive standing army looking for Palestinians or Arabs that can beat down. The people who are at the brunt of this fighting are often young people who've been pulled out of university, or professors like this one, or someone working at a bank or at a restaurant who are having to fight for the survival of their country and to try to recover the prisoners that are still held hostage, including 6 Americans.
Thank you so much for that added nuance and clarification. There's lots of questions. Those of us who are in this little virtual room, we can see all the questions that are coming in. We're going to take a very short break right now, just about 3 minutes, a short little video. It'll give us a chance to kind of collate some of the questions. And as I predicted before, we have enough that we could probably be doing this until tomorrow morning, answering all the questions. We'll get to as many as we can. So we'll take this short break. We'll be right back with you.
It worries me that so many Christians have such a superficial understanding of their faith. If we're not learning apologetics, we are not learning how to defend our faith, to be able to articulate it to the world, we're not going to be able to learn how to fully live it out in the world. Those of us who claim to be born-again, serious Christians, taking our Bible seriously, reading it literally, they go to church, they figure they're doing their religious duty, nice thing to get dressed up on Sunday morning. That's not being a Christian. And unless you're prepared to die to yourself, you're going to have trouble calling yourself a Christian. Over the years, I've watched Christians struggling with their Christian story and explaining their beliefs to fellow Christians and others who inquire about their faith. I came to realize that we needed to teach as many people as possible how, in a winsome and intelligent way, Christ has affected them and how they see Christianity affecting our culture. What's desperately needed today is a call to action. It is to Christians to get serious about their faith that's given once for all and trusted to the saints, as Jude teaches. It is to understand it so that you can live it, and it's to understand it so that you can defend it. Christianity is not just a personal relationship with Jesus, it's a way of seeing all of life. It's a way of seeing how God views the world, and then ordering our lives accordingly. Our culture urgently needs men and women who can winsomely present the Christian worldview in their sphere of influence.
Well, welcome back. Thanks for watching that brief little video. So glad to have you back here. Again, we have many questions continue to stream in. And if you do have a question, could I see the number up here again real quick? 844-872-1088. Send those in at any time. And even if we don't get to them now, we sometimes will use them and we'll try to answer them on Breakpoint, various options that we have, some writing things that we have. Well, again, lots of questions that we can get to here. And the question, actually, I'm gonna cheat. I'm the moderator, so I'm gonna ask my question, dealing with the significance. I'm a history buff, and I love seeing the scope of history. And one of the things that really is remarkable, that I think is getting passed over in recent American political polarization, is the Abraham Accords. The fact that the Saudis, I think it was a few weeks ago, the people in Yemen, I never know how to pronounce the name of the group, the Houthis, whatever it is, and they were shooting missiles at the Israelis. And the Saudis helped to intercept them. And then when the Iranians shot some missiles recently, the Jordanians helped to intercept them. What is the significance in this particular conflict? What are the Abraham Accords? And what is the significance theologically, politically, all of the above, for this, at least so far, peace between the Arabs and the Jews? And I'll start with you, Dr. Patterson, because I think you were the first one who mentioned it, but I would love to hear Dr. Myers as well on this.
Sure, I'll just briefly say that Israel fought wars in 48, 56, 67, and 73 against its neighbors, and then had a modest but very, very important peace deal in 1979 with Egypt called the Camp David Accords. But since then has not had peace deals, treaties with any of its other neighbors. And so it's been an uneasy peace, although I would say over the past 15 years, with the rise of Islamist terrorism like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, that there's been closer and closer private cooperation between the intelligence communities and the defense communities of Israel and some of its neighbors. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that type of terrorism. And second is that the Arab countries like Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Egypt, and others have deep concerns about a revolutionary Iran. So all that being said, during the Trump administration, a major, major breakthrough was that 3 of Israel's neighbors signed what we call these Abrahamic Accords, formal peace treaties with Israel for the first time since 1948. So it's a real breakthrough. And last fall, it looked like at least 2 more countries under the Biden administration were willing to sign. Now, you can see this is actually a bipartisan world peace, regional peace type of initiative that's very, very important. And just like Hamas's October 7th attack kind of dropped a bomb on so many relationships that people have in the United States, Europe, and elsewhere, it brought to kind of a halt further action on these 2 new political deals. I'll turn it over to Dr. Myers from there.
Yeah, that's a great summary. The Abraham Accords are largely with Arab nations. Iran is a Persian nation. It's a different kind of Islam. If we have a chance to talk about it, we can. It's very apocalyptic. It cannot achieve its apocalyptic goals until Israel is annihilated. So Iran is absolutely committed to the annihilation of the state of Israel and the death of the Jews who live there. But it is fascinating. Nations like Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the UAE, Egypt have all outlawed Hamas. You did not see celebrations in their streets, at least in Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, UAE, when Hamas went on the attack. You did see celebrations among the leaders of Iran, but not even in the streets. It's very strange. I met with a journalist, an Arab journalist named Khalid Abu Toma, and he told me, I am terrified when I go to American campuses. He said, I've interviewed every Hamas leader there is. I've interviewed every PLO leader there is, personally, face to face. I felt more afraid on American university campuses than in those situations. We have not reckoned with the fact that it is in America, on American campuses, where largely leftist progressives have adopted not just the Palestinian narrative, because there is the Palestinians as we see them today are tribal. They're a bunch of different tribes. It's not easy to say these are the people, but Hamas is very easy to identify. And their propaganda, you mentioned in their 2017 charter, is very clear. Word for word, it is the chance taking place on campuses. Word for word, it is the narrative that is taking place in the United States of America among people who are anti-Israel. So Israel and the surrounding Arab countries now have far more in common than they have apart, which is what led to the Camp David Accords in 1979 between Israel and Egypt. That is a positive sign. Hamas must be isolated. I don't know if you ever eliminate them completely, but you can eliminate ISIS. That doesn't mean every person who was in ISIS died. It just means they don't have any authority to tell everybody else what to do anymore. Same with the Nazis or Al Qaeda and other groups. That's what needs to happen with Hamas.
That last point is really important, because what's unique is I can't think of any other people group around the world where there are people chanting for their genocide, and no one, including the Jews, says let's have genocide of all the Palestinians. We're in this unique cultural moment where people around the world are saying push them out to the river to the sea, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, and calling for the genocide of the Jews. And so, regardless of different theological traditions, dispensationalist or covenantal theology, and how someone might fall down on different views, we all should be against, and this is true for secular human rights people, we should all always be against genocide in any form, because every person is made in the image and likeness of God.
So good.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. All the dynamics that are going on with this, the historical stuff. I remember just the very fact of the Abraham Accords that points back to what you mentioned earlier. It goes back to Abraham, the covenant. It refers to the fact that Ishmael and Isaac were sons of Abraham. I remember many years ago, I was in seminary, and this was another outbreak. So it shows this is going on. This is probably 20 years ago now. There was another outbreak of violence in the West Bank, I think. And someone said, well, what is it the American government has done now to cause this? And I turned to him and says, no, this is because there was one guy 4,000 years ago, and he had a son named Isaac and a son named Ishmael. Now, that's a gross oversimplification, but I think it shows that many times that we as Americans, we have a very narrow window understanding of what all this is going on. Another historical note, I remember after 9/11, bin Laden's number 2 guy, al-Zawahiri, I think his name was, and he said, we won't let happen to Palestine what happened to Spain. And most Americans are like, whew, what does that even mean? Well, from our perspective, that means nothing. But from their perspective, Spain, they lost Spain. Spain was once Muslim territory, and the Reconquista comes along and they drive them out. That historical perspective, that this has something bigger to do than our one immediate moment, is something I think, particularly our students, who, again, the reason TikTok is so popular is because of that short attention span that we often have, is that the particular students these days have been raised on these short piecemeal things, and that's how they get their news. And that's actually one of the questions. There's one question Dr. Patterson wanted to get to, but I want to get to this one real quick because I think it's connected here. So many people are getting their news from odd sources, and I got to admit it, pretty flagrantly biased sometimes. Now, sometimes that's flagrantly biased one way or the other. What would you say are some good news sources where people can get some information, whether that's a particular one that's solid all the time or a plethora of several news sources that would be by trying to find the middle of all of them, we can find some insight. So what are some news sources you think are helpful in this?
Yeah. So for me, if someone wants to if they want to do a little bit deeper dive on how Christians might be thinking in this tradition about foreign policy more generally, you ought to sign up for providencemag.org, which is more of a blog and things that comes out once a week, a set of articles about foreign policy. When it comes to daily news, I'll tell you what I do. In the mornings, I listen to the podcasts of the BBC and of World News, the Christian organization. And if there's time when I'm in the car, NPR, and I hear 3 pretty different perspectives there that triangulate. And I have a subscription to the Wall Street Journal on my phone. And so between that and the news app on my phone, which for some reason seems to be all People magazine and celebrities, people I haven't really heard of, but it's actually kind of interesting to see what in that space is happening. And then I personally actually look at The Guardian, which is a pretty far left British newspaper that has great sports, but it's also an interesting perspective. I mean, the difference between, say, the Wall Street Journal and The Guardian, and there's some good reporting in both, but it does help me to see. I may not agree, and I may think that people they're playing loose with the truth, but to see what they're saying is very, very valuable. But if I was when I was a dad with younger kids, if I was going to only have one or two things I'd look at, I think World for Christians would be an extremely helpful news source. And then some other kind of straight news like BBC Wall Street Journal.
Yeah.
And how about you, Dr. Myers?
I think that's great. I think the Wall Street Journal, at least editorially, I like it a lot. Their reporting is easier to follow. That they do a better job of listing the constraints, especially when you're reporting on places like Gaza, where there are no reporters in Gaza. People don't realize that. The people who are in Gaza sending out the news are stringers who are controlled by Hamas. So places like the New York Times don't bother to mention that. The Washington Post has never mentioned that. So the Wall Street Journal is clearer in that respect. On news related to Israel, I follow a couple of different sources. One I follow is the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. I follow an organization called MEMRI, MEMRI, which is the Middle East, Research Institute. Anyway, MEMRI, MEMRI. They translate all of the Arab social media posts and interviews from Hamas leaders into English. So you can hear exactly what these individuals are saying. As far as the Israeli newspapers, I read regularly. I read every day. I read Haaretz, which is the far left newspaper, and then Times of Israel, which is a more conservative newspaper. Jerusalem Post is kind of in the middle of those two. But you got to understand that unlike some of the Palestinian territories, Israel is not monolithic. They have 55 different political parties. 15 of those political parties have seats in the Knesset. Even the leader of the nation, his Benjamin Netanyahu, his political party, Likud, only has 32 seats out of 120. It's not anywhere near a majority. So they have to rule by coalition. And then you also find that there are people from 103 different countries speaking 85 different languages there. The whole idea that it's some kind of a European plant to destroy the Middle East, some sort of a white settler colonialist state is a total and complete fiction.
That's really helpful because, like I said, I think a lot of us, we don't know where to get our news, particularly as, online sources and newsfeed algorithms, tailor us to listen to just this or just that. That's a new world of, online world. And it's really helpful to have some of those key things. And I think that the ones that translate from Arabic into English, I think that's really helpful because if you do pay attention to some of these things, you know that some of the things that people say in English to the West is one thing. And then what they say to their own people in Arabic is something else entirely.
Oh, exactly. And that's the slogan is the main thing. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Does not rhyme like that in Arabic. That's intended for an English-speaking audience. And 55% of the people chanting that were polled. 55% of them don't know what river and what sea
I saw that
they're chanting about.
Absolutely. Well, before we get on the next question, there was one question, kind of a housekeeping question. Some people have asked whether or not this will be available online. And the answer is yes, it will be available on YouTube after the live stream is done. So you should be able to access that here just once we're done almost immediately. So that's a very helpful thing. Well, one question here that I think kind of reaches both of your worlds because it kind of touches on the theological aspect, but also the meaning of just war. And that is, people say, what did Jesus say you're supposed to do? Well, you're supposed to love your neighbor. Well, what does that mean? How does that fit into war? Now, how does that fit into this particular situation? How does this fit into the larger questions of just war, of like, what does it mean to love your neighbor? How does the God of love tell you to go to war at times? How does the Prince of Peace say, yes, there's a time to kill? So if each of you, I'll start with Dr. Myers this time, if you could just what does it mean? How does the Christian call to love your neighbor fit in with this conflict where literal neighbors are at war?
I was waiting for Eric to respond so I could riff off of it.
Okay.
No, this is a very important question, powerful question. That commandment to love your neighbor was given in the context of Israel having been, in the time the law was given, under attack by all of its neighbors, just like it is today. So you have to remember that the context was in the context of war. And most of life is in the context of war. Will Durant, the great historian, said out of 3,000 years of human history, only 268 years have been completely at peace. So war is the natural state of humanity. And in that context, what do? You personally love your neighbor. You personally, you love God, you love your neighbor. Love your neighbor has implications for you, how you treat other people personally. It also has implications for law. A big part of love your neighbor in the Hebrew law was what we call tort law now, or negligence law, that you must not take any actions that you know will harm, or that you that a reasonable person would know would harm the interests of that other person. Those are significant things. I think in this situation, I'm curious to hear what Eric says. When we talk about genocide, the whole thing about genocide is what the intent is. That all of the law about genocide in the United Nations is regarding intent. So you have an intent of pursuing justice, protecting civilians as much as you can, which Israel has done. Typically, 9 people died in an urban warfare situation for every 1 combatant killed. Israel has kept the number of non-combatants that we know of down to about 1 person killed for every 1 combatant killed. That's part of loving your neighbor. It does not mean not going to war. It means making sure that, as Eric said earlier, as much as possible, non-combatants are protected, that you have a very clearly outlined aim, you pursue it in a just way, and you have a right intent. I think that is loving your neighbor.
Very interesting. But yes,
You know,
if you could,
one thing I'd pick up on that is, by the way, I agree totally. So I'm just going to add one thing, and it's in my Just War book. C.S. Lewis asks this question: what does it mean by love my neighbor as myself? And then Lewis says, well, what does it mean to love myself? It sure doesn't mean I like myself, because I know what I'm really like on the inside. And that there are things that I think, that I want, that I do, that are wrong, that are sinful. And so, of course, I love myself, and inappropriate self-love is actually very, very healthy if we see ourselves as children of God. But we know that there's so many things in our own self that are not right. And think about that same framework for loving your neighbor as yourself, particularly a violent neighbor, an injurious neighbor, an unjust neighbor, a neighbor who's hurting the vulnerable, for instance. I can love my neighbor, but recognize that they need government authority to stop them from hurting others. I can love my neighbor, but denounce what they're doing. I can love my neighbor and believe that they are a criminal who needs to be stopped, needs to be tried. Maybe even military force needs to be used to stop them from killing and hurting others. And that's a really useful way of thinking about this, that love and like are 2 different things. And that loving may mean restraint, it may mean punishment, it may mean justice, it may mean stopping them from doing further harm, because we live in a fallen world and we are all sinful individuals.
absolutely.
That's great.
I think that so much of it can get down to the question of what is love, and like, what does it mean? We have kind of a nebulous view of love. That love, well, again, love is affirmation, and so love must mean to do. Not obviously, we would think that love is to do what's good for our neighbors, but sometimes we think what they would want us to do, and that simply can't be. One example that I've often used, but again, that feels a little dated given the particular context, is if it's 1943 and I'm a GI in North Africa. Or let's say 1944, in Europe, moving in France and Belgium and whatnot. And how do I love my neighbor Hans, who's on the other side of the line? That's a good question. That's a difficult question to relate to. Well, there's not just Hans. There's also Hannah. There's Hannah who's in the camp, who's behind Hans. You have to bring that into it. There are questions of, is my loving for Hans going to allow me to just let him continue to do the evil that he's going to do to Hannah or whoever else? And that is, I think, the difficulty, because we are, as I said before, we are between Eden and the New Jerusalem. You said the war is the natural way. It is the new normal for life now. That conflict is going to be, the tension is going to be. We live in an imperfect world. So I think it's very difficult questions we have there. One question that I think is very interesting here is people have asked about who the Palestinians are. Do they come from someplace else? Are they a tribe? Do they ever have their own land? So we've actually, I'm accommodating like about 10 questions that have come through here, but like, who are they? And I think that for many Christians, we hear that many of the people in Bethlehem, in Hebron, in all these areas, that they are various versions of either Church of the East or Eastern Orthodox or various other forms of Christianity. So that's a whole lot of baggage there. How do we work in that with the people to say who? So this is a two-part question. Who are the Palestinians? Where did they come from? And that sort of thing. You've already answered some of this to some degree, Dr. Myers. But also, like, how should we relate to those Palestinians who are Christians in one form or another?
Oh man, so good. Well, you want me to jump in, Eric, and then
Please.
Yeah. Okay. So 99% of the Palestinians are Muslims by religion of Arab descent. They many of them have lived in their families have lived in that area for a very long time. They were going to coexist with Israel. That when Israel was formed as a state in 1948, the Palestinians were asked to also form a state, and they refused. They refused again in 1967, 2000, and 2008. But they did decide to go to war against the Jews who were there in Jerusalem, and they lost a lot of ground as a result of that war. So anybody who was displaced in their homes, that's the reason why they were displaced. They were resettled. There are all kinds of resettlement programs in that area, and the layers of bureaucracy and who's in charge and who does the policing is all very complex. But the Palestinians are today, most of the world has gone along with the idea that you're really only Palestinian if you're Muslim. There are, however, there are very, very few, but there are some Palestinian Christians. In Gaza, to be precise, there were, I think, 990 Christians when I last checked, out of two some million people. I asked the IDF specifically about those 990 people. They said, we know where they are. We have their addresses. We're making sure they're taken care of. So somewhere there's been this idea developing that when Israel attacks Palestinians, that they're attacking Christian people. And again, I'm not saying that, like Eric pointed out so brilliantly, all human beings bear God's image. In fact, one of the hostage moms, Rachel Goldberg, told me, if you're only sad when your side's babies die, your moral compass is broken. It is a tragedy when people who are stuck in the middle end up having their home destroyed. They're hungry. They cannot take care of their children. They get sick. They die. This is a tragedy. We don't, it's not something that we wish would happen. But I don't know, Eric. I mean, I'm hearing so many bizarre things that people are saying that have no basis in fact in this particular situation, and I'm sometimes at a loss of how to respond.
I would agree. And I do think that Rachel's comment is just one that brings us back to our moral center that says, let's take a religion and let's take ethnicity and let's take race and let's take nationhood out of everything and start first with, these are human beings that we're talking about. And so I'm going to use Dr. Zeus. If on October 7th, the star-bellied Sneetches had crossed that border and raped, pillaged, and plundered the plain-bellied Sneetches, or whatever group you want to call them, the red Converse versus the green Converse wearing people, and that we ought to be thinking in terms of first compassion, but also long-term security and justice. And this is true in other contexts. So we think about Rwanda in the 1990s. We think about Sudan, basically anytime since 1956, including today. We think about, for instance, Darfur. We think about Afghanistan. We think about Ukraine. We don't want to dehumanize the enemy. And so I think one thing in all of this, I'm going to pick up on your word, Jeff, is to recognize the tragedy of it. And yet, political leaders have to take actions to be working towards releasing their hostages and towards securing the peace and to promoting justice of the perpetrators. And we're still at a point right now where there's still kidnapped victims. The leaders of Hamas are still belligerent, and at any time in the past 7 months, the leaders of Hamas could have said, "Okay, we're done. We here are the people who were kidnapped. You can have them." And the entire world would have at that moment said, "Okay, Israel, you have to stop." Right? But we've not had that type of moment. And leaders have to be thinking not just about what happened yesterday, but what's going to happen next week and next month and next year. And so the leadership of Israel, it doesn't mean that they get a carte blanche for everything that they do. It doesn't mean that they don't make mistakes. It doesn't make, I don't think any of us are saying that every action of the secular state of Israel today is some sort of holy action. But I would say that those leaders, particularly a democratically elected state, have to be thinking in terms of all of their citizens tomorrow and next week and the week after that. That's pursuing justice, and that's pursuing a common good security, not just for their own people, but for the region.
Oh, very good. Thank you so much for that. There's, the getting the facts on the ground, I think, is very important. Knowing these details. And actually, before we move on to the next question, could you each? We've gotten a couple of questions about your respective books. Could you each, Dr. Myers, first tell what your title of your book was, and so the people have been asking about that. So if you could share that.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. The new book is called "Should Christians Support Israel?" And you can get it. This is what it looks like. You can get the book by going to summit.org/forum. I have a free copy for you for participating in this webinar. So just go to summit.org/forum and you can claim a copy of that book. Because the people who are on this call, Tim, are very influential people. I would appeal to each of you. If you like the book and you think it can be useful, then order a bunch of copies and give them to your friends, your children, your grandchildren, especially those in Gen Z. And here's why. We found in a poll that we did recently that Gen Z most of them hate Israel. But if you give them facts, they change their mind. Half of them change their mind if you just give them the facts. So you can't just say, well, we're going to try to compete by putting out as many YouTube videos or as many TikTok videos as the other side. You're not going to do that, but you can challenge them to read a book and consider these facts, and you'll find you can make a lot of progress.
And Dr. Patterson, if you could share your title.
Thanks. And this latest book is called A Basic Guide to the Just War Tradition, Christian Foundations and Practices. It's from Baker Books. You can find it easily on Amazon or from Baker Academic online. It's a thin, inexpensive volume, and it's really targeted towards teachers and parents and students. It has everything in it from how to think about heroes like Iron Man to people in the Bible like Hezekiah, and the difference between, say, someone like David or Joshua and someone like Deadpool or Samson or Achilles. And it starts with biblical framing and the principles that we talked about earlier, such as stewardship and justice and neighbor love.
Well, thank you very much. And I've read both of them. I can give 2 thumbs up to each of them. So my recommendations there.
And I've read
next question.
It's great. So yeah, please do.
Yeah, yeah. There we go.
Sharing each other's books.
Yeah. One question I want to talk to is kind of several. Again, as many of these questions are very much related, and deals with the concept of genocide. That is the term that gets thrown around. That is what the Gen Zers say they're against. The Israelis are committing genocide. People will say, well, it doesn't matter what the cause was. October 7th doesn't matter anymore because the Israelis are committing genocide. They're just mass slaughtering. So I guess I could add, it's kind of one question for each of you, but each of you can answer either part of it. For Dr. Patterson, is what is genocide defined as? Like, what does it mean technically? And then for Dr. Myers, I mean, again, both of you address this as well as you can, as well as you wish. From your time on the ground there, is what's going on there genocide? So both of you answer that a little bit, kind of a different emphasis there. So Dr. Patterson, if you could start, what is genocide?
Yeah, genocide is a very new concept. We did not have the concept of genocide in international law before World War II. And it's a response to the attempt to entirely eliminate a people group, eliminate their history, the facts of their existence, and their very existence today and for the future, which is what the Nazis tried to do with the Jews. Most countries, including, the United States, signed a convention starting in 1948 called the Genocide Convention, where we have made a legal promise to intervene in places where we determine that there's a genocide. So in other words, it's a never again promise. And in the case of the US, we have in our own federal code a parallel version, more or less, where we have promised to the international community, as have many of our European allies, that if we determine that there's a real genocide going on, where one people group is doing everything they can militarily to utterly eliminate another people group, that we will take action. I would just say that if Israel was trying to eliminate all of the Sunni Arabs, it would be a much, much bigger thing.
Mhm.
If they were trying to kill all of the self-identified Palestinian Arabs, then they'd be lobbing bombs into Jordan, where there's over
Right.
1 million Palestinian Arabs. They'd be killing Arabs within their own borders. There are many Arabs, including some in the Israeli military and things. So this is not genocide by any of those definitions. And of course, Israel probably, it's kind of a wink wink, has atomic weapons. They're not using that type of force, carpet bombing. There are ways, if you wanted to just kill everybody in Gaza, that would have ended it all quite a while ago. Israel would not have sent soldiers into hospitals to rescue babies and get them out. None of that would have happened if they were trying to eliminate entirely this people group.
And Dr. Myers, if you could address the situation on the ground.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Well, spending time with the IDF was interesting. The point Eric made earlier is really significant to understand. These are everyday people. I sat next to a guy at dinner. He had his rifle. He had the barrel up and it was wavering in my direction, which made me nervous. And I thought, hasn't he ever taken a safe hunter course? And then I realized, well, 2 weeks ago, he was a train driver. He was a train engineer. He's not trained for this. He just believes he has to protect his country. But what they do get trained in are very specific, clear, strict rules of engagement. Hamas does not bind itself to any of these things, but Israel does. Mm-hmm. I asked several different people in the IDF, when you're in there, how do you know who the terrorists are? And their answer was, they're the ones that shoot at us. Well, America would never endorse going into a war situation where you have to be shot at before you can defend yourself.
Right.
That's just not what we would ever do. But that is the way these individuals are bound. Of course, they make mistakes. Civilians are killed on occasion. That happens in every war, as we've already talked about. I did also notice that the artillery, which was going overhead while I was there, and that's a little unnerving, their artillery strikes are extraordinarily precise. Mm-hmm. They can target a house in a neighborhood to be destroyed from 5 miles away. Mm-hmm. So it's not indiscriminate bombing. That is not at all what is happening in this situation. There's so many more things I could say about it. I think one of the things that Israel's been accused of is that starving the Gazans. There was a study done between October and April by 2 Columbia University professors who found that Israel had allowed across the border or sent 290,000 tons of food aid. Mm-hmm. That is enough to meet 50% of the calorie needs for every Gazan. Mm-hmm. And because Israel is not doing a genocide there, they have left the agricultural production of Gaza intact. If you were an army and you wanted to commit genocide, the very first thing you would do is destroy their food source, because then they would all die within a matter of weeks. Israel has not done that. 75% of Gaza's agricultural production is still intact. So Gaza should be having 125% of its food needs met. Why is that not happening? And the answer is that Hamas is committing a genocide against its own people, of the people it's supposed to protect. They have stolen the food. The top 600 Hamas leaders have all become millionaires by skimming off of international aid. The top 5 have a combined net worth of $11 billion. Khalid Michel, who's the sort of a godlike figure in Hamas, has a net worth of $5 billion. He flies around in private jets and lives in 5-star hotels in Qatar. If you were the leader of Hamas, would you be collecting money and making yourself rich at the expense of your people? Not if you really wanted to lead. Only if your only concern was not the lives of Gazans, but the destruction of the nation of Israel. And while we're on the topic, though, there has been a genocide in that region in the past, and it was largely after the state of Israel was formed. All of the Arab nations in the area forced out virtually all of their Jewish residents. 850,000 Jews were forced out of their homes. $300 billion of economic value in their businesses lost. There are fewer than 10,000 Jews remaining in the countries that are surrounding Israel. And so that actually does constitute a genocide. Why Israel's being accused of genocide now is a political manipulation. If we have time, we can talk more about it. It involves a very bizarre nation called South Africa.
Yeah. A lot of complex things going on there. And I think that just for me, it's morbidly fascinating to see the factions, the alliances that are being created and dealing with all this. So, well, we only have a little, unfortunately, we don't have time for that. We only have about 5 minutes or so left to get to some of these things. One question I want to get to is the nature of the land, because this is almost a unique conflict in that, well, it's not entirely unique, but the specialness of that particular land. I always thought it irony that Jerusalem, Jerusalem, city of peace, is not in a peaceful place. This place, I mean, part of it's the geography of Africa, Europe, and Asia come together there. What constitutes the promised land? What for the Israelis is the land? So kind of biblically, what's the promised land? Temporarily, 20th and 21st century, what is the state of Israel? What are the Muslims wanting and the Arabs wanting in this? How does that specific land, the specifics of that on-the-ground geography, how does that play into this conflict? So, Dr. Patterson, if you could start off on that.
I would just say that this is a question for Jeff.
Okay.
I'm happy to do it, but he deals with some of this in his book. That's what I want to give.
So the nation of Israel, as it exists today, was negotiated. It was a British protectorate. The British got it because they defeated the Ottoman Empire. They just inherited it, and they took care of it. There are all kinds of political machinations going on to form it. But what Israel was in the past was what is currently the border of Israel, plus Gaza, plus some parts of Egypt, plus what is traditionally called Judea and Samaria, what is now by the Palestinian Authority called the West Bank. So those are the borders of Israel. So Israel today is much smaller than it was during different points in time when Israel was strong in the Old Testament. But it is still those people in the land. And they do believe it is a fulfillment of prophecy. Even secular Jews believe that it is a fulfillment of prophecy. So if you say, well, it's not, modern Israel has nothing to do with ancient Israel, you would have to automatically say the prophecies in the Bible have nothing to do with current times or the future. And I'm not an expert on end times, but I do think that what is described in the book of Revelation, chapter 21, has yet to come. I don't see how that's even controversial. So we know there are prophecies that are in the Bible that are yet unfulfilled. If that is true, then you can look at the way modern Israel has developed, turning desert into garden and so forth. There are very, very specific prophecies that are coming true at this time during our lifetime.
No, thank you very much. That's that many versions of that basic question came up, so I was very glad to hear that. I've got two closing questions. One has to do with the fallibility of the Israelis. Many people asking, why do the Israelis not like Netanyahu? As you mentioned, he only has a quarter, 25% of the legislature there. What's the problem with him? And I've been around long enough to know that one, he's been in power off and on for a very long time. And he's also been indicted many times for various other things. So that's the one thing with him. But then breaking down the fact that the Israelis, they're not believers. They're not Christians. And some of them, the earliest Israeli, the kibbutzim folks, they were kind of Marxists, and they had some interesting ideas. And how is the relationship, us dealing with this people who aren't perfect, who aren't pure as the driven snow? How do we as Christians relate to that in this situation?
I'd start by saying that that last point that you made, that no one is infallible except for God, no one is holy except for God, is a good starting point. And part of what we've been criticizing here is one extreme that says these are somehow subhuman people, they're terrible, they're evil to their core, and they ought to be killed, right? We've seen that on our campuses, in some campuses in April and May, and that's totally, totally wrong. At the opposite, far, far extreme is some sort of moral carte blanche for any government, whether it's Washington, D.C. or someplace else, including Israel, that says, well, anything they do, they get to do. That they kind of have moral absolution for some reason. And that's just not the case. Israel was run, as you were hinting, for almost the first 30 years by the left of center parties that were agnostic and atheist socialists. The Labor Party ran the country for the first 3 decades, and that makeup has changed in recent years. But we're talking about a country that is one of the many countries around the world today that has government officials and people in the military and things that try to follow the rule of law, try to protect their citizens. But just like you and me, they're fallen members of humanity. And we ought to recognize just kind of that basic principle when we're thinking about situations like this.
Mm-hmm. And Dr. Myers,
That's
you want to
really
add
good.
anything in there?
Well, there are 57 Islamic nations in the world. There's one Jewish state. There are 1.5 or 1.6 billion Muslims in the world. There are 15 million Jews. There are 120 Muslims for every Jew. And 95% of Israel's Muslim neighbors hate Jews. So they are surrounded by constant threats all of the time. What holds them together is a belief that God has put them in this land. Even the secularists there are moving toward this viewpoint. I'm seeing religious revival there. So it's a very secular state. And people there don't claim to be religious, by the way, because it actually feeds into the Muslim propaganda if they say we are a religion. They rather refer to themselves as a people. But there is a dramatically growing religious revival taking place there among Orthodox Jews. The Messianic Jewish community is growing dramatically. I see God doing a lot of amazing things that are happening during this time. But I'm with Eric. That does not mean that we as the United States of America need to put our stamp of approval on everything Israel does.
Right. Yeah, I think that last bit is, on the one hand, people who think we can only be critical of the Israelis, you need to read some more history of the neighboring countries and what's actually going on there. And those who think you can never say anything bad about the Israelis, some very strong evangelicals who do that, I think you need to read the Minor Prophets. God is perfectly content to say some very strong words about the Jewish people down through the years. Okay, for my last question is it's not one here on the list, it's just one I think our audience would really appreciate. Many questions have been doing with how do we get these college students away from this? How do we get the Gen Zs away from kind of the radical kind of things? What is something that parents, grandparents, friends, loved ones, for people who are caught up in from the river to the sea, what are some good, aside from Dr. Meyer's book, of course, what are some good resources, some good tactics you can think of ways that we can reach out to people and get to the reality that isn't the, carte blanche, as you were saying, but also isn't the anti-Semitic thing? What are some good tactics you can think of, either resources or just practices?
Would you like for me to jump in?
Please.
Sure.
Okay, yeah. There are 3 chapters in the book, Should Christians Support Israel, with very specific ideas on how to do this. Let me say it first of all starts with the mindset. Dr. Stephen Hassan is the #1 guy in the United States of America who helps people come out of mind control cults. If you look at his definition of a cult, you realize that what young adults are facing in America is that they have been enslaved by a mind control process. It is indoctrination. And the way to free people of indoctrination, first and foremost, and all the way through the process, is caring concern, presenting facts that move outside of the information control that they've been subjected to, asking them questions, making them reflect, confronting them with things that disrupt the narrative that they hum to themselves so that they don't have to think. Right. And there isn't any substitute for that. It has to be dialogue.
And Dr. Patterson?
One thing I'd pick up on this is that the way that we taught history, particularly U.S. history, until maybe 15 years ago in high schools, was America, with all of its warts and things, nonetheless, there's a great story here. It starts in 1620, the Mayflower Compact. And what we see in the early charters and in the American War for Independence and the struggles of the first half of the 1800s and the Civil War and the movement back and forth fighting over Jim Crow and things, was overall people coming here from around the world, from Latin America, from other places, looking for freedom of religion, the right to assemble, the right to raise their children in their faith, the right to print, publish, learn, all of those things, and economic opportunity. And Slow, Halting Steps is a story of wonderful, hard-fought progress. Martin Luther King Jr. in his I Have a Dream speech said, the Declaration of Independence was a promissory note for us. It has to do with African Americans, and we want to see its full enfranchisement, its full realization today. That was his dream. So that's a way of thinking about history through Ronald Reagan and others. But the last 15 years or so, an insidious anti-American and anti-freedom history has developed, and it's very simple. There's always an oppressor, and there's always an oppressed. You can call it wokeism. It's really kind of a neo-Marxist critical theory categorization. There's always an oppressor, and that person kind of usually looks white, Anglo-Saxon male, straight, etc. And these days, you get brownie points if you can figure out which victim group you're in and kind of claim victimhood. And it's a very deconstructive, destabilizing, demoralizing framework that you cannot build a society upon. And so what Jeff said about reality is crucial. Teaching real facts and real history, listening to our young people and engaging them in real dialogue, and sharing readings with them, asking them to share things with us. Well, how did you get this information? You share something with me, I'll share something with you. And I do believe, like he said, that's how the truth will work itself free in these young minds.
So well, good. Thank you so
By the
much.
Way, send your young people to Summit.
There you go.
Dr. Jeff.
Exactly.
And places like that. That's a crucial thing. Is we need to send our young people to places like that, to our Christian colleges and universities and things. Send them to places like that.
Yeah. Get some good worldview education there. Well, I think we could probably keep talking about this for several more hours, and that would be a lot of fun, but I know that we all have various other things to get to. Again, a reminder to people who've been online, this will be available, I think, almost immediately after the live stream ends. We did have a couple of just one more little housekeeping things. Several people were asking Dr. Myers about they couldn't access the via the website, but we have had people work, so it is possible. It's not being blocked, so if there have been some issues with that, but we'll hopefully get all that straightened out. I think that's all straight. It is working just to some degree, so that's a positive thing.
If you want to, you can also just go to summit.org, and there you'll see a link on the front page that will get you to the book as well. Yeah.
Excellent. Well, here in a few weeks, we're going to be having another of our Breakpoint Forums, this one about the also controversial issue of Christians in politics, basically dealing with how should Christians be involved in politics. And this year is always going to be a time for that, and election years seem to be all the time now. So that's, I think, right now is scheduled for July 16th. So we're still working out some of the details on that. So you should get some emails about that if you have been part of this and you see some things on social media as well. We'd like to thank our guests, Dr. Patterson, Dr. Myers, for joining us today for such a rich conversation. Again, I wish we could keep going, but my wife probably wants me home to help with the kiddos and everything like that, and I should appreciate that. So again, thank you very much.
Tim, thank you. Thank you, Heather, off behind the scenes, and your entire team. And thank you to everyone who participated tonight. I'm grateful for the tough questions. That makes a great discussion.
I say ditto. Thanks, everybody. Much appreciated.
Well, thank you, Evan. Good night.